Hey IB environmental students, we're going to be talking about ozone depletion for topic 5.6. So first, before we get into the details of ozone specifically, we need to talk about what are the different layers of the atmosphere. And this is a really great image that showcases this. We can see that the different layers with the highest altitude to the lowest altitude closest to our planet are as follows. The troposphere, right, is going to be at the bottom. Then the stratosphere is a little bit higher up. Then mesosphere, and then thermosphere. And then in between each one there's some pause, and that's kind of the barrier between the different layers. And we'll notice this red line showcases that the temperature changes very drastically between the different layers. We're going to mostly focus on the troposphere and the stratosphere. The troposphere is the layer next to the Earth's surface, and 75 to 80% of the mass of the Earth's air is included in that layer. Here's what its composition is. It's 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen. We normally think about oxygen being the most, right? Since that's what we think is most important, but it's mostly nitrogen. There's some water vapor in that composition, some argon gas, which we don't really talk about that much, and carbon dioxide, which we'll talk a lot about more when we get to climate change. We're going to mostly be focusing on ozone in this topic, and in order to do so, we have to learn about how it works. So the chemical formula of ozone is O3, and it's formed from an oxygen atom and an oxygen molecule. And it's found both in the lower stratosphere and somewhere else. So in the lower stratosphere, we like it. It's the ozone layer, and it protects us, smiley face. In the troposphere, right, it's going to be the result of human pollution, and it's usually thought to have bad qualities. And we're going to talk about those details later. How does the ozone form? Well, ozone's going to form when, or break down actually, right, when we have this O3 ozone molecule and it's hit by sun's light radiation, and it'll break down into atomic oxygen and the oxygen molecule, right? And we can break it down even further, those oxygen molecules, to get these oxygen atoms separately. And we can take one of those atoms and reform ozone by adding it to an oxygen molecule. So this is a replenishable process. We can kind of go back and forth breaking it down, reforming it, but that process happens slowly, but it will happen naturally. How does it really work? So it's going to be able to absorb radiation, and it does that when the UV strikes the O3 atom, and it'll break that bond, forming the oxygen atom, the one oxygen, and the oxygen molecule O2. That's that process. And that's going to happen once again when the sun hits the ozone layer. And we like that. Why? Because it protects us from the harmful UV radiation. And that way we don't get hurt, we don't get cancer. However, there were these chemicals that started in the 1930s called CFCs, which stands for chlorofluorocarbons. You're just going to call them CFCs. And they had a lot of benefits where we live in the troposphere. They were stable, they were odorless, they were non-flammable, non-toxic, and non-corrosive. And they were used as coolants, propellants, and fumigants. Things like in our air conditioning, things like our hairspray, things like insulating our houses. So many uses. We loved them. And when we were using them, they would go into the atmosphere just from use, from leaks, when we were producing them. But unfortunately, it started to be found in the 1970s that it was lowering the concentration of ozone in the stratosphere, and so quickly they called for a ban. How does it work to make this ozone whole? Well, CFCs have chlorines, that's the C in the first C in CFCs, right? And the chlorine atoms for CFC are split when they're hit by UV radiation, which they will when they're in the atmosphere. And when that happens, it can destroy ozone molecules. One CFC molecule can destroy 100,000 ozone molecules. That's terrible. That's not good at all. And that'll create ozone holes because the ozone will be depleting faster than it's replenishing in its natural cycle. And the holes tend to happen in the North and the South Pole, and they tend to be seasonal. The levels of ozone were dropping about 4% per decade at that time. And then during the spring, over half of ozone seems to be destroyed. So somehow it's really seasonal. The impacts of this ozone hole can be on human health, things like burns and potential to cancer and bad for our immune system. Here we can see how it might impact our skin and cause skin cancer. Not good at all. It can impact plants and our foods, how it will destroy the plants and lead to lower productivity, lower crops. It'll impact the food chain. It'll impact wildlife, could give wildlife cancer just as much as it could give us cancer. That could decrease populations of different species, both terrestrial or aquatic. It would reduce the populations of phytoplankton, which would impact all food webs. So there's a lot of pretty tough impacts. But not only that, earlier in this unit, we talked about how ozone was related to air pollution. Don't forget that ozone is part of smog. It's actually the most major component of smog. And it'll degrade other sort of human-made products. So ozone in the troposphere, no good at all. So humans decided, well, we need to get together and really try to repair this ozone layer. It's naturally will repair itself since it's replenishable, but we need to do something because we might destroy it so much that it can't bounce back. So there was a lot of legislation that was made, and we're going to talk about those in detail on the next slide. And it was very successful for CFCs, but not the next thing that was trying to replace CFCs, and we'll talk about that later. We could limit driving, right? Because driving is going to relate to smog, and it might also relate to how much CFCs are being produced. We could use friendlier cleaning products that don't use CFCs in general. And we can avoid pesticides that also might contain CFCs and other harmful chemicals. And let's just reduce NOx in general, because NOx in general is also going to be a part of smog. Lots of really good management strategies. And rocket launches just have tons of propellants, right? That's CFCs galore. Okay, here's the really cool stuff that's really specific to ozone that usually doesn't happen as management strategies. Let's really hone in on the legislative or the regulation part of management strategies. So for ozone, this Montreal Protocol occurred in 1985, and 24 countries really got together and said, let's get rid of these CFCs, right? And then within 15 years, they reduced CFC production and release by 30%. And we can see without the protocol, look at this ozone destruction that's occurring and how much CFCs is being produced. But now with the Montreal Protocol, there's a leveling off and even a gradual decrease. And we can see that these are all the types of CFCs that would have originally been produced, and they're starting to decrease. And now more countries are even participating. This is a wonderful example of global cooperation, which normally doesn't happen. Wonderful. In the U.S., we can think about our country specifically. The government was one of the countries that ratified the Montreal Protocol, and how we really worked towards that is we had taxes on CFCs, and that caused a couple years after the Montreal Protocol, 2 years later specifically, for instance, companies like McDonald's stopped using styrofoam altogether, and eventually the foam packing industry had to stop using CFC products too a couple years after that. But notice that ozone issues are definitely related to how urban an area is. The redder on this map, the worse the ozone air quality is. And a lot of that has to do with smog. Lastly, more recently, we have this legislation, Copenhagen. Copenhagen was dealing with the fact that there was another very similar cousin to CFCs, HCFCs, that was trying to replace CFCs. And Copenhagen said, ooh, this is no good. These HCFCs are actually greenhouse gases, and they do tons of damage for climate change. So they in 1992, about 7 years after Montreal Protocol, decided all the more economically developed countries also would ban HCFCs within the next decades. And that is a wonderful extra example of how collaboration internationally is also making a big difference. So think about that, and well done on our last pollution notes, guys.